Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan Trush, and I'm the Director of Research Partnerships at the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the team leading this initiative through ESDC's Workplace Opportunities Removing Barriers to Equity program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm calling in from Haliburton County on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations of the Three Fires Confederacy. This is also part of the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and is covered by the Williams Treaties. I want to acknowledge the longstanding relationship that Indigenous peoples have with this land and recognize that this history continues today. For me, this acknowledgement is a reminder to approach this work with respect, curiosity, and a commitment to learning. Today's session, Are We There Yet?, is part of a broader effort to support organizations subject to the legislated employment equity program in strengthening their capacity to create inclusive and equitable workplaces. While we've seen progress in many areas, women continue to face structural barriers in access, advancement, and leadership. At the same time, expectations around equity, accountability, and inclusion are evolving quickly. Today's an opportunity to take stock of where we are and to ask some honest questions about what's working and what isn't, and think together about what meaningful progress looks like going forward. To take us through this important topic, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Wendy Cukier and Nancy Mitchell. Wendy is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management, founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute, academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and academic research director of the Future Skills Center. Nancy is the director of consulting at the Diversity Institute, where she works with organizations across the public sector, private sector, and civil society to develop research and strategies to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility within organizational processes. Previously, she worked as a consultant for UN Women, and she holds a master's degree in political science and women and gender studies. Participants can feel free to share questions in the Q&A or chat box throughout the session. We'll pause periodically throughout to discuss. And with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy and Nancy to get us started.
Thanks so much, Megan, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and welcome back some of you who have attended a few of these other sessions, and welcome to the new folks around the room as well. And I will share my screen, and I will also encourage you to, it's not such a big group that we can't take questions as we go along, but when I'm managing the slide deck, I can't see your questions, so I'm really counting on Megan and Nancy to keep tabs on that. So I know that many of you are probably recovering from many International Women's Day events and activities, and I was saying to Nancy and Megan that maybe this was not the most compelling topic to offer at this particular moment in time. However, I do think it's important to continually emphasize that gender is not done. And in some ways, one of my key messages is International Women's Day is, recognize one day of the year. Women are the 51%. So every day is, in fact, Women's Day. And one of the things we wanted to do, especially in the context of backlash and uncertainty, really reinforce what progress we have made in terms of advancing gender equality, but also what remains to be done. So I'll provide a bit of an update on where we are, and Nancy will talk about what we need to do. Key thing, most of you I think know us, but the key thing about the Diversity Institute is really that we're based in the business school. So while we have a commitment to social justice and to human rights, we are really preoccupied with the ways in which equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, truth and reconciliation help organizations do a better job. Because we know, and I say this as as a business professor, marketing 101 is you have to tailor your strategies to the populations you're serving. Women are more than half the population. You're missing out if you're not creating workplaces that attract, retain, and include them. The other thing that we talk about is not just talent as one of the drivers, but the importance of serving an increasingly diverse population, whether you're a policing agency, whether you're government, whether you're Starbucks, whether you're a large financial institution, recognizing the unique needs of women as customers, clients, citizens is critically important. And we also know an intersectional lens is needed because not all women are the same. We know that increasingly women are business leaders in this country right now. They own almost 20% of businesses and are partners in another 17%. If you think about the agriculture sector, for example, or many of the consumer facing sector, retail stores, and so on, often those are family businesses where women own 50% of the assets. We also know that doing a good job with equity, diversity, and inclusion helps retain women and improve satisfaction and performance. And we can talk more about some of the things that are emerging on the horizon that, in my view, may prove to have unintended consequences when we think, for example, of some of the back to work mandates that are being imposed in certain industries. There are clearly implications for parents who have childcare responsibilities, and often those responsibilities fall primarily on women. And so we may actually see an increase in the exodus of women from the workforce if we're not mindful of some of those issues. And if that isn't sufficient, we know that there remain legal and reputational costs. This lecture series is really targeting federally regulated organizations which have very specific legislated requirements around reporting on representation and their strategies for designated groups, women, racialized people, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous peoples. At the same time, regardless of the sector, regardless of your company size, you have obligations under human rights legislation, under accessibility legislation, and other things that mean that if you mess this up, it's not just legal and financial costs that you may be incurring, it's also reputational risks. So it is important to remember that women are almost 51% of the population, and all women are not the same. So 5% are Indigenous, 27% are racialized. Nearly half of Canada's Black population are women, and women are overrepresented in the Black community as entrepreneurs and business owners. Almost a quarter of women in the country are newcomers, and almost 30%, which is higher than the overall rate of women reported living with a disability. This has to do in part with the aging population, the fact we live longer. It also has to do with broadened definitions of what a disability is to include mental health issues as well as cognitive differences. And over 4% identify as 2S LGBTQ+. So when you think about that, and you think about the overall population in Canada, a majority, a significant majority now, if you think about women, you think about racialized people, you think about persons with disabilities, a significant proportion of the Canadian population are actually part of the designated groups. We also know that, as I said, there's lots of evidence that organizations that do a good job on equity, diversity, and inclusion generally, but gender in particular, have more women on boards, more women in leadership, outperform others. And there's lots of evidence that links, for example, reduced risks and having more women in leadership roles. It's funny because a lot of people talk about women being risk adverse as if it were a bad thing. I'm more inclined to think of women as prudent and helping to keep organizations out of trouble. We also know that women punch above their weight in terms of making purchasing decisions. They account for 75 to 80% of all consumer spending. And so companies really make a mistake when they don't take that into account. And I'm old enough to remember when women were primarily used to sell cars, when the vanity mirrors were only in the passenger side, and the car manufacturers seemed not to understand that women could actually drive and make decisions about purchasing cars. And we've seen lots of improvements in terms of the understanding of women as a market segment, women's preferences, how you sell to women, how you support and serve women in recent years, but there's still issues that have to be addressed. Women, as I mentioned, are now almost 20% of business owners. They generate almost $100 billion a year and employ almost a million people. And in addition to that, they're shared owners of about 17% of businesses. Just to put this in perspective, I think there are probably some bankers on the call. The banks employ 300,000 people. So women-owned businesses employ 3 times as many people as financial institutions. And yet, when we look at how decisions are made and policies are developed and who's at the table, you see a lot more bankers than women business owners. We also know that women are, on average, better educated than men in the workforce. They now have almost 60% of the bachelor's degrees compared to 40% of men, and they've reached parity in terms of PhDs. At the same time, they're underrepresented in things like trades. And we know that those decision processes are very much affected by societal values and start very young. And that's part of the reason why at the Diversity Institute, we're really preoccupied with investing upstream in girls in school, because we know by third grade they start to develop assumptions. And one of the worst the best bad examples that I have is grade 3 standardized testing. Little girls outperformed little boys in both English and mathematics. But when asked, are you good at math? Are you good at reading? Little boys were more likely to say yes. And that kind of socialization continues all the way to CEOs when people talk about imposter syndrome. We also know that there is segregation that often comes because of stereotypical gendered role models. So women are more likely to be in things like education and humanities, and still much less likely to be science, technology, engineering, and math. Although they dominate in disciplines like biology, they're really underrepresented still in areas like engineering. And we did some research on this that shows that some universities, U of T, Queens come to mind, have broken the 30% threshold in terms of women enrolled in engineering, where others, my own included, are half that. And what that tells you is it has nothing to do with women's aptitude or ability. And we see this when we compare Canada to other countries. It has to do with socialization. It has to do with assumptions about what is required to be successful in those areas. There are now more women doctors and more women law students than men, but there are still issues that emerge. Megan, is there a comment or question?
There is. We have a question in the chat. Do we have the figures for Black women in terms of education?
We do. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we can send it in terms of follow-up. I can tell you definitively that uh, Black people in Canada now have achieved educational parity with everybody else, but they are 60% more likely to be in jobs requiring over only high school education. And my recollection, and we'll check this and get back to you in the follow-up, my recollection is that Black women tend to have higher levels of education than Black men, but I'm not 100% positive on that, so let us check.
Thank you. The follow-up on that is there parity with white men?
Uh, I believe there is parity. I believe there is parity between the Black population and the white population now in Canada in terms of education. Surprisingly to many, perhaps not to others, is because immigrants tend to have better levels of education than people born in Canada. We actually see some racialized populations exceeding educational levels of white men. And as you saw in the earlier slide, uh, overall in Canada, men are quite far behind women in terms of educational levels. I hope that answers the question. Apologies. Don't have it off the top of my head, but we will share the deck after the presentation, and I can add in some slides that disaggregate the data for the Black population, unless Nancy has this off the top of her head, having worked on the SOBER report recently.
I'm responding in the comments or in the chat.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. Thanks.
I also have a hand up from our friend Tamara. Can I bring her off mute to?
Sure.
All right. Tamara? Tamara, are you there? Hmm.
Tamara, we can't hear you. I guess we'll have to move on, and maybe Tamara can get her technology working and or put her comment in the chat.
Yeah, sounds good.
The other thing that we see is that women are what contributes to things like wage gap is um, what we would call occupational segregation. And again, we tend to see, just as we see with education, we tend to see that women are underrepresented in some sectors like construction, manufacturing, transportation, and warehousing, although they're gaining ground. I mean, the percentage of women in trades has almost doubled, but it's still relatively low, whereas they're overrepresented in areas like educational services, health, and social services, accommodation and food, public sector. We know that in the federal public service, for example, women are overrepresented in many leadership roles. But if we look at financial services, they're underrepresented relative to their participation in the workforce. The other thing is when women do enter non-traditional occupations like uh, science, technology, engineering, and math, they tend to they tend to self-select out because of negative experiences in the workplace. So they're almost twice as likely after getting an engineering degree and getting an engineering job, they're almost twice as likely to jump ship after experiencing what it's like to work in that environment. And the same, unfortunately, is true in sectors like construction, which still have a long way to go in terms of creating inclusive and healthy and safe workplaces for women. As I mentioned, we also know that there are intersectional perspectives on these issues, so that everything I've said overall with respect to women is worse for Indigenous women who have much higher levels of underemployment, um, and greater wage gaps. We know that newcomer women are better educated than women born in Canada, and yet they tend to be less well employed and also experience wage gaps. And we see when we look specifically at racialized women, and we don't have Black women broken out here, to further to the question that was asked, but we see that the employment rate for racialized women was considerably lower than for others. And some ethnic groups, like West Asian women, had the lowest levels of unemployment, of employment, sorry. We also see differences in earnings. So even when women graduate in STEM, they get paid less. And women get paid less overall, but racialized women get paid considerably less. And this is partly because many racialized women are also internationally educated, and we have a terrible problem in Canada with not recognizing international education. We also know, and this came to light particularly during COVID, when women were simply crushed by the burden of unpaid work. But even now, women are often juggling their employment or their education with their caregiving responsibilities, and they're far more likely, from research that we've done, far more likely to report difficulties finding affordable childcare. We do have national childcare policy, but there are gaps in the implementation. And this has implications for mental health as well as physical health for women. And as I said, it's a separate discussion, but the back to work mandates that are being implemented are falling most heavily on women, on persons with disabilities who often are better served with flexible working arrangements, and lower income people who often cannot afford the commutes.
Wendy,
When we look at,
we
sorry,
we have a few questions if that's okay.
oh, sure.
Great. Okay, so a couple questions, similar vein. So a couple slides back, you had mentioned that women in men-dominated fields are maybe leaving the field, and someone had asked if they're leaving or if they're being pushed out of these jobs. And then similarly, someone had said in Ontario, many women leave their profession, even though they studied in male-dominated roles after 3 to 5 years. Is this due to harassment in the workplace by their male bosses? And then therefore, is the solution women mentoring? Women getting mentorship in male dominated spaces. So
Very, very good questions. And I would say people are pushed and they jump. So sometimes women in the workplace get frustrated because they're not advancing in the way that they should be. They're not being as successful. They're held to a double standard, higher standards. We know many women leaders, for example, who are critiqued for behaviors that are perfectly acceptable in men, and so on. So there are some women who are choosing to leave. And we saw this with South Asian women in particular, who were indicating they plan to leave the workplace and start their own businesses. So that's one phenomena. But no question, we also see evidence that women are pushed. And the notion of violence in the workplace, in my view, is a continuum. So there's physical violence, which is relatively rare, but there's also psychological violence and harassment. And even where it's not overt harassment, there are microaggressions. And I will show you in a moment how that plays out with women generally, but also women from specific identity groups.
and there was also something similar. Someone just had a thought that many women with disabilities perhaps leave and go into entrepreneurship. I had responded, 'cause I also think that there's a level of flexibility that entrepreneurship provides women with disabilities that maybe isn't there in, traditional employment. But did you want to respond to that?
No, you're absolutely right. And we've done research on that as well. But it's also why the back to work mandates potentially are problematic for persons with disabilities and particularly women. The other thing I wanted to say is the question about mentorship and sponsorship. There's no doubt in my mind that women need sponsors, and there's a lot of research. We did some recently suggesting that women are over mentored and under sponsored. So mentorship is someone tells you what you should do. And sponsorship is someone tells other people what they should do, which is to hire you, promote you, and so on. And for sure, we need that. But I also think that we need to apply the rules and the regulations that are in the workplace. And often we see this over and over and over and over again. And you don't have to point to Jeffrey Epstein. Um, People know what's going on. People know about levels of harassment, both lateral harassment, downward harassment, upward harassment, all sorts of things that women experience, whether they're at the bottom of the organization or the top of the organization. And I would argue that bystanders are one of the biggest problem. And so we really need, in my view, to bake in policies, processes, rules, enforcement, but also collective responsibility for creating safe workplaces. And, when women have critical mass, they tend to be safer. It's generally assumed over 30%. Environments where there are more than 30% women, especially in leadership roles, often are safer and more inclusive, not always. But in environments where women are very much in the minority, very much in the minority, and I mentioned some of these, manufacturing, construction, and so on, they really need leaders who get with the program and take action. And so, and Nancy will talk more about this. The key to creating inclusive workplaces is not talking just to the people who agree with you. It's also trying to find ways to help others understand why this is a priority. It's not a partisan issue. It's not a wokeness issue or a political correctness issue. It is simply how we create success. Sorry, Megan, another question or comment?
Um, there was also a comment in the chat about understanding of women and their bodies and different realities through the life cycle during their working years. For instance, there's a lot of discussion around menopause and a lot of judgment around that, when we should be looking for ways to uh, empower and enable women of all ages to participate in the workforce.
Agree completely. I mean, I am a woman of a certain age, and I have observed very clearly you don't even have to look at the Lisa LaFlamme example, but there's no doubt that women, I mean, Nancy can speak about this and you can, Megan, younger women are often not taken seriously or given the authority or the power that their roles entail. And older women are often viewed as kind of irrelevant. And, I have stories. We all have stories of how um, older women are often treated like, they're your mom or your BFF or your Aunt Matilda, as opposed to being given the respect that they deserve given their roles and responsibility. We hear a lot about older women being told to smile. Like no one in the history of the world ever tells a man to smile more, or women in leadership roles being called bossy. Again, never in the history of the world. I defy you to find one example of a man being called bossy. And why is that? It's because it's assumed men are natural bosses. And when women exhibit those characteristics, they're aberrations. So, there's still One of the things I find the most frustrating is the idea that gender is done. We've been doing this for a long time. We've been talking about it a long time. We've moved on. The fact is, all of the research shows it's not done. We've made progress without question, but we still have a long way to go. Sorry, Megan?
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's another question comment in the chat related to opinion surveys revealing that men are feeling disadvantaged by the focus on women. Um, any observations in that regard?
No, it's a valid comment, and it's there when you look at everything, including radicalization of young men, the emergence of white supremacist uh, radical movements, and so on and so on and so on, the incel movement, and so on. Again, it's a continuum, but we are seeing evidence that certain segments of men are feeling disenfranchised, and that's playing out in very negative ways. We also know that men's mental health, suicide rates, victimization and violence. There are all sorts of things that we probably don't pay enough attention to, and there's been a lot of suggestion that we need to think about those issues as well. I think that the fact of the matter remains, look at the data. And so some men may be feeling disenfranchised, but on balance, men are still paid more, have higher employment rates, and are more likely to be CEOs and paid accordingly than women. So it is a delicate balance. And Nancy will talk more about thinking like a bear, which perhaps will provide some insight. So most of you have probably seen this before. I want to get through my last few slides and hand it over to Nancy. But we see that although women are now really at parity in terms of the workforce, that isn't reflected as they move up in organizations. Although we are seeing senior management ranks getting closer to parity, so that makes me optimistic. We've also seen for the first time women have broken the 30% barrier on the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is, in my view, significant. We have to make sure that progress doesn't stall. And we see big differences between sectors. So again, one of the reasons why I am a fan of the employment equity legislation, even though it is 40 years old this year, because we see federally regulated organizations in federally regulated sectors have done better in terms of women, racialized people, Indigenous people, persons with disabilities. Legislation does make a difference, and it isn't that the employment equity legislation establishes quotas. It simply requires that you report, and we know what gets measured gets done. So I'm a big proponent of employment equity. Also, coming back to the issues of intersectionality, we've done this study over and over again, looking at representation across sectors in leadership roles of women, racialized people, and in 2020 we added in uh, Black people. And just a couple of comments that I wanted to make is when you look at the percentage of the population, for example, in Toronto that is Black, 7.9%, and you see 6.4% of leaders are Black, that looks like we're making progress. But look at what happens when we consider racialized people. They're 48.6% of the population, only 15.9% of leaders. And with women, it's 51% of the population, 39% of leaders. One of the things that this research really underscored for me was the importance of intersectionality, because in the city of Toronto, or the GTA, half the population is women, half the population is racialized, right? So for every white woman, there is a racialized woman. When we look at women in leadership, however, white women outnumber racialized women by a factor of about 12 to 1. So it's very important, in my view, to look at gender, but it's also very important to consider intersectionality because the experience of racialized women, the experience of Black women, the experience of Indigenous women, women with disabilities, immigrant women, women who identify as 2S LGBTQ plus, and so on, very, very different than others, and we have to take that into account. Also noting that strangely in Hamilton, where 4.3% of the population is Black, 3.6% of leaders are. And so we can see there are differences in the leadership representation of women, racialized people, and Black people by cities. This brings me back to the earlier discussion about racialized women, Black women, and so on. And this is a big study of experiences of discrimination that was done over several years. And I'll just walk you through it quickly. So when we look overall on whether people reported experiences of discrimination, total was 19%. Among women, it was 26%. Among men, it was 12%. But if we look at the Black community, what we see is significantly higher rates for women than for men. When we look at the Indigenous community, significantly higher rates for women than for men. When we look at youth, significantly higher rates for women than for men. And in every single category, we see that women report discrimination based on gender as well as other dimensions of their identity. I mentioned women in business are very important to Canada, and yet we know that they're smaller and more vulnerable and often not at the table when we're talking about international trade and major projects. And this is an area we're really focused on. And this is an area where, in my view, federally regulated companies, especially the big ones, can really advance this agenda by using procurement. And we know a lot of the big banks, for example, and a lot of the public sector companies do bring a gender lens to their procurement decisions. In my view, if women own 20% of the businesses, you need to have an explanation why they don't have 20% of the spend. So at this point, I will turn it over to Nancy, unless there are any last questions or comments.
No, I think we're okay. Oh, there's one. Um, this just came in. When studies examine women's contribution, do they compare women and men on a per person basis or equal group sizes to see ratio of contribution? And how do they account for factors like age, pregnancy, family responsibilities to ensure a fair comparison and help understand future trends?
So I'm not entirely sure about what is meant by contribution, but if you're looking at things like productivity, performance, and so on, I'm not sure to what extent we have data on, for example, GDP per person, but certainly when we look at contributions of women-owned businesses versus men-owned businesses, you're absolutely right. You have to disaggregate the data. So you have to look at sector, you have to look at size, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we do know is that to the comment, women's career cycle and business cycles tend to be very different. And it's part of the reason why progressive organizations, for example, post-secondary institutions, if they're comparing the research productivity of a man and a woman, they will always ask questions about what are called career interruptions that men can claim as well as women. And those could be interruptions that are a result of illness or disability, parental responsibilities, or other things that have changed the trajectory of their careers. So it is very important if you want an apples to apples comparison to take into account those issues. But, I would argue taking into account issues of privilege, opportunity, and resources are also really important if we want to understand talent and performance.
Thank you.
Back to you, Nancy.
Great. Okay. So it's over to me to talk about the way forward. And Wendy's gone through where we are right now through a number of different lenses, whether it's education to employment to leadership to entrepreneurship, and some of the persistent gaps for women in all of their diversity. And I'm going to speak about what we can do about this. But before I go through some tangible actions for change, I do want to emphasize the ecological model for change, because I think it's a great framework for understanding and conceptualizing the barriers and also the solutions. So what we know is that barriers for women exist at the societal, organizational, and individual levels. This is anything from the way that girls and boys are socialized at a young age, like Wendy explained, all the way into the different sectors or areas of focus that they choose to study, which leads to occupational segregation, wage gaps, and leadership, and then also the way that we treat one another. And these, like I said, are not mutually exclusive. But what I will say is the good news is that while there are barriers at each of these levels, opportunities for change and strategies for change also exist across the levels. And when you address the issues in one level, it will have spillover effects into the other levels. So if you address the socialization, that impacts all the different areas that I talked about. So opportunities for change across the different levels. I'll be speaking mostly to the organizational level, also just given the time. So we'll flip to the next slide. Thanks. But I'd be remiss if I didn't just share a little bit on the societal level, because I think it is the broadest and the biggest. And just to note that we do have legislation that protects women and gender diverse people from discrimination, like human rights codes, as well as legislation that's more proactive in ensuring that there's representation and inclusion of women and gender diverse people in workplaces. So the things that you're subject to, like the Employment Equity Act, as well as things like pay equity. And then legislation is, of course, intended to be coupled with broader supports and standards and infrastructure. So things like transportation and childcare, whether that's processes and supports or whether it's policies. I'm even thinking, and we didn't talk about health, but Indigenous women or rural women and the childcare supports and transportation that they need to be able to access the services that they need, recognizing that women often take this role on in the household for their own health and the health of their families. So those pieces are important, as well as things like processes on GBA plus, or for example, we just wrote a publicly available specification on gender inclusion and EDIA in climate resilient infrastructure for municipalities. So you have your high level legislation and regulation, as well as all the supports that then make this possible. And then I would also be remiss if I didn't talk about media, which I'll speak to on the next slide. But media really does shape our gender norms, expectations, and the socialization piece that Wendy had mentioned previously. So we'll go to the next slide. And I won't spend too much time on this because I do want to get to the organizational processes, but it's just to say that I was doing some research previously on representation of gender in advertising, and it's not just about whether women in all their diversity are shown in media, it's the way that they're portrayed. There's no use in showing women in negative stereotyped ways, like that's not helpful. So it's about the representation and the portrayal. So the media piece, but also emphasizing women in men-dominated fields, for example, STEM, construction, and so forth, and then women in leadership roles. And I would imagine, like Wendy said, that many of you came out of International Women's Day events where women were showcased. And I'll go through some more tangible ways that I think visibility can be done aside from these kind of panels, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that these kind of panels are important for showcasing the visibility of women, especially in men-dominated sectors. So this is where I want to spend the bulk of my time. I'll share the slides after because I kind of have a lot to get through, and we've got 11 minutes. So ultimately, from our perspective and what the research shows is that embedding gender equity and equality is best done when it's baked into all organizational processes. So, starting from governance, leadership, and strategy, all the way to outreach and expanding the pool. We have a tendency to let EDI or gender equity live solely in HR processes. And I'm not saying that that doesn't have a significant role to play. But even if I'm going back to the comment that one of you made in the chat on men feeling like they're left out of the conversation or that they might be threatened by all of the efforts that we're putting in place for women, if it only exists in HR, then I think that that mentality will continue to be replicated. But if you consider it in governance, for example, which we'll go to the next slide, I think that it'll have a better effort in actually mitigating some of these feelings. So, starting with leadership, governance, and strategy, I would say first off, it's really about setting the tone from the top. And one of the key pitfalls I see in organizations is that they have their EDI strategy as separate from their organizational strategy overall. But actually, it's about linking EDI or gender equity and equality to the overall goals of your organization and your commitment. So, how does it connect to attracting and retaining a diverse talent force? What does it mean for service access and usage for people in all their diversity? Keeping in mind what Wendy said about women making the major purchasing decisions for households. How does it connect to risk mitigation, both from a legal and a reputational perspective? So ultimately, if you have these kind of EDI goals as separate from your organizational strategy, then it will continue to be seen as a nice to do and something that you're doing out of the goodness of your heart to support women, and men will continue to be left out of the conversation, as opposed to embedding it in your strategy, which makes it a business imperative and something that is everyone's responsibility and that benefits everyone, including men. So that's really key. And then coupled with that are frameworks for understanding where you already are in your process and what kind of efforts you put in place and how you plan to measure these efforts, as well as forthcoming efforts. Because data-driven solutions are also one of the key ways that you dispel some of the myths of like, well, we're doing this for women because it's the nice thing to do and it's International Women's Day and it's all fluffy and roses, and puts it into the perspective of like, this is a business imperative, here are KPIs, and here's how it's supported change. I'll pause here because Wendy, I know that just back on the slide, but did you have anything you wanted to add? Because this is a big piece for us.
No, not at all.
Okay. And then the last thing I'll say here is I think it's about leaders modeling inclusive behaviors and setting expectations, which goes back to the tone from the top. We can go to the next slide. So I know I said that this kind of work doesn't only exist in HR, but HR is a big part of it. And you can think of the pathways for an employee all the way from job design to exit. And I want to start in job design because this is where I think some of the very first barriers for women and equity deserving groups exist. It's really about you thinking of the skills you actually need for a job and the way you communicate those skills. And when I make my job postings and often when I review job postings, I see that there's a tendency to be quite all encompassing. So you're going to have like 25 different skills that you say someone needs, and you write about them in such a high level theoretical way that actually women and equity deserving groups self-select out of applying because it's too jargony and it feels like it's not attainable. So even thinking of, do I need complex and advanced tech skills, or do I need someone who can do scheduling and make a PowerPoint and navigate Excel? The way that you communicate and the decision of what skills you need is critical from the first step. Then making sure, like I said, that the way you communicate those skills is not done in a gendered way. Oftentimes we have a tendency to say like an assertive, driven, whatever kind of person, but you can imagine that had what Wendy had said previously on the fact that those things are not necessarily valued in women because they're called bossy or shrill. So just think about the ways that the language is coming across. And then even in your selection processes, thinking about the qualities that a woman might demonstrate in terms of being quite assertive and not putting a bias label onto that and labeling it as like a non-culture fit, because those are the exact tendencies that we would have celebrated in men candidates, for example. I also think the outreach piece is key, diversifying your outreach channels so that you're not going to the exact same ones you typically go to that may be men dominated or dominated by people from non-equity deserving groups. We can go to the next slide. I do see some comments in the chat, but I'll just finish these couple slides and then take them, and maybe Wendy, you want to jump into. The tone of this slide, I want to be really clear. My intention here is not to say that women need fixing and that can all be solved through mentorship. Absolutely not. I think that formal mentorship is a really critical piece of the puzzle. And I have some examples here. I also think it's really important for us to consider informal networking, and that a lot of the times the advancement opportunities that are shared in an organization, whether intentionally or not, are shared at the water cooler or after work at the bar or when everyone goes golfing. And oftentimes women are left out of these informal networking spaces. So I think that the formal mentorship piece is critical, but I also think ensuring that you review your advancement processes is also key. So clear performance reviews and appraisal processes where people know the exact process they need to take to be successful is key, noting that a lot of times opportunities are shared in these informal ways. We can go to the next slide. So I talked a little bit about visibility in the beginning. This is, I think, really important. And I mentioned that, of course, there were lots of International Women's Day pieces and panels, and that's great. But I also want to talk about visibility in ensuring that women are able to showcase their skills internally in front of leadership and in front of clients. And if you're a manager on the line, I'm talking specifically to you, think of the team you have and whether you're always giving what I'm calling the quote unquote hot jobs. So the ones that are with big clients, the ones that are going to be visible and give people access to promotion opportunities, whether those are always being given to the men on your team or if they're being dispersed evenly. When you're sharing in front of senior leadership, are you giving the women on your team space to share their contributions, how they contributed to a project, presentations? Are you giving them opportunities to manage staff and that kind of thing? Because visibility goes beyond these kind of panels of celebrating women leaders and is actually about ensuring that women are seen in the organization as driving change, because that connects back to advancement opportunities later on. I'll pause for a second and see if there's any questions. Okay, portrayal in media is key. Yeah. Okay. All right, I'll keep going, Megan. If there's anything, you just flag it to me.
Sounds good.
Thanks. And I'll be brief on this one. Oh, actually, you know what? Before I do, one more point on the visibility piece that I didn't mention and I think is key. Wendy had mentioned earlier sponsorship. And this is a key visibility piece that is a little less visible in the sense that it requires someone sharing your name and your contributions in a space that you're not in. But nevertheless, that is visibility. And so if you're a manager on the line, this is my direct call to you as well. When you're speaking with your other managers or your senior leadership and you're providing updates, are you sharing the contributions of the women on your team and saying what a great job they've done, what an asset they are to your team, etc., in these spaces that they're not in? Key for sponsorship. Okay, I'll go briefly through the separation practices. It's really, I think, about ensuring that you have a clear exit interview process where you're asking people about their experiences, their reason for leaving, and any general feedback. I want to emphasize that you should be doing this well before someone decides to leave for whatever reason, but I will say that you're more inclined to get some honest answers when someone is on their way out, again, for whatever reason. So don't be remiss or miss this opportunity to get some of those perspectives, and be sure that those perspectives feed right back into your understanding of what's working well and what can be improved. We can go to the next slide. Values and culture, a big one. 3 minutes to unpack it. But what I will say is this often feels like the most theoretical one and the least tangible one. I would say that it does start with policies at the very outset to ensure that you're setting expectations on what everyone in the organization is required to do when it comes to inclusion, anti-harassment, accessibility, and so forth. I would also say that it relates to flexible work arrangements, parental leave, and childcare. Someone in the chat had mentioned that oftentimes that falls on women's responsibilities and men are not encouraged to take up parental leave. And I was reading some research from the UN that showed that actually when men take on paternity and parental leave, women are better placed to advance in their careers, which ultimately also shrinks the wage gap. So these kind of things I think should be encouraged. And then I've given some specific calls to managers on the previous slide, but what I'll also say is if you're a manager in the space, think about even your team dynamics and the team meetings that you lead on a regular basis. I lead a team meeting every Monday, and it's my responsibility to know the different people I have on my team, what they like, what they don't like, what their fears are, what their strengths are, who's more likely to speak up in the meeting and take all the time, and who's more likely to put something in the chat that everyone misses because we're all listening to so-and-so. It's your responsibility to know those dynamics and make sure that the women on your team are not left out of the conversations. We go to the next slide. I think this will maybe be my last slide because I think it's a big one. And then if you want the deck, you can have it. But I had mentioned at the very beginning that it's really important to set up measurement frameworks so that all of your decisions are data driven. So ultimately, when you're embedding EDI and gender equity into your existing strategy, you want to make sure that you look at your goals, and maybe your goals are to improve workforce representation, which many of you have to do anyway because of employment equity. Maybe you want to foster a better inclusive workplace environment. From there, you would set some key actions that you think are going to support those goals. Maybe it's revisiting your hiring practices. Maybe it's implementing clear expectations for managers, all the things I mentioned previously. Then you're going to attach some KPIs to each of those actions, and you're going to measure on a regular basis to understand, again, where your existing gaps or lingering gaps are and what can be done to improve that. And then that informs updating your strategy. So, again, to ensure that everything is data driven. So, I'm going to pause there. Wendy, did you have anything else to add on the actions? And then maybe we'll take some questions.
Not at all.
Okay, and again, I have a couple more actions related to procurement and outreach, but you can have the decks, so you can look at those a little bit later. But now let me just see what's in the chat. Yeah, I see something from Yvonne, and I want to emphasize this because intersectionality is key. And you had mentioned what Black women need is white allyship. It cannot be underestimated. And then a couple of other pieces. Yeah, I totally agree. And something that we had done in the past is mentorship programs, but inclusive and thoughtful mentorship, recognizing that if you're a mentor, you can't mentor everyone in the exact same way. You have to recognize the nuances that Black women experience. So while white women may be called bossy, Black women are called aggressive. So the advice that you give has to be tailored to the experiences of the mentor you have. And I know that you're also talking about allyship, which is key. I think sponsorship is critical. And I think people in the organization, whether it's men or white women, for example, speaking up to support women in all their diversity is key. So empowering the perspectives of these people, showcasing the great work that they've done in the organization and so forth. So thank you for flagging that.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Let's,
think that's all the questions I see.
I think so. Yeah, I think we've covered that. Wendy, any final thoughts?
Not at all. Just as usual, we'll send out the deck, we'll send out the link. And if any of you, Megan can put our emails in that mailing. If there are any other things you would like us to follow up on, we're more than happy to. I think some of you know, but as part of the Warby Project, we've compiled a very big database of leading practices, and not only things like you should have a skills matrix for your board, but you should have a skills matrix for your board, and here are three examples. Or you should have an anti-harassment policy, and here are some examples of what other organizations are doing. So Nancy could have gone on at some length to actually show examples of how different organizations of different sizes in different sectors are doing this work. And we're more than happy to share anything that we've got with folks on the line. So please feel free to follow up. And thanks for your time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for joining and for the great conversation. Have a wonderful day.